Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at a really interesting study, and I think it's super relevant to what a lot of regions are dealing with right now as we think about transitioning to a cleaner energy future.
Definitely, yeah.
This study is, it's got kind of a long title, but it's called Transforming the Electricity Generation of the Berlin-Brandenburg Region.
Okay.
So right away, we're talking about a specific area, and I think it's worth sort of setting the scene for people who might not be familiar with this part of Germany.
Yeah.
Berlin, of course, is the capital city. It's very densely populated, lots of energy demand there.
Right.
But it's surrounded by this state called Brandenburg, which is much more rural.
Yeah.
And historically, Brandenburg has been really reliant on this type of coal called lignite, which is, not exactly the cleanest fuel source.
Yeah, definitely not the direction we want to be going in for the future.
Right. So you've got this like tension almost,
Okay.
right? You've got this high demand city, and then you've got this surrounding area that has this legacy of, kind of dirty power generation.
And that's a really common story, I think, in a lot of places around the world,
Yeah.
where you have this sort of urban-rural divide in terms of energy sources and energy needs.
Exactly. And that's what makes transforming the electricity generation of the Berlin-Brandenburg region, this study, so interesting because it tries to tackle this question head on. Like, how can a region like this, with this kind of unique setup, actually achieve a really high level of renewable energy?
Yeah.
Not just like, a little bit here and there, but really making a significant shift.
A substantial transition.
Right.
Yeah.
And they don't just talk about it in some vague way. They get really specific.
Mm.
They look at potential pathways for, first of all, up to the year 2020.
Okay.
So that's like a near-term kind of horizon.
Yeah.
And then they also look further out to 2030. So they're thinking both about the immediate steps that need to be taken, but also, the longer-term transformation.
And what I appreciate about this study is that they don't just sort of hand wave and say, oh, renewables are good, we should do more of them. They really get into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah.
They use these really sophisticated computer models to simulate different scenarios, different mixes of energy technologies. They look at cost optimization. They consider the limitations of the existing power grid, like how much electricity can actually flow from one place to another.
And that's what makes it so valuable, right?
Yes.
Because they're not just saying, oh, this would be a nice idea.
No.
They're actually trying to figure out, okay, how would this work in practice?
Yeah.
And, spoiler alert, one of the things they find that I think is super interesting is that a much faster increase in renewable energy use, like way more than is currently being planned, is totally possible in this region.
Right. And that's a key takeaway. It's not
Yeah.
just about saying, oh, we need to do more. It's about saying, actually, we can do a lot more, and here's how.
Exactly. So I think to really get into this, we need to start with a snapshot of what the energy situation was like back when this study, transforming the electricity generation of the Berlin-Brandenburg region, was done.
Yeah. Let's lay that groundwork.
Okay, so first of all, just to understand, the electricity network in Berlin and Brandenburg, they have a pretty strong interconnection, right?
Yeah.
Because historically, Brandenburg has been a major electricity producer, particularly from those lignite power plants.
Mm-hmm.
And they mentioned this company, 50 Hertz Transmission GmbH.
Yeah, 50 Hertz, they're the ones who operate this really extensive transmission network, high voltage power lines.
Right. So that kind of sets the stage, right? But
Yeah.
then we need to actually look at the numbers, like what types of power plants were actually online at the time.
Okay, so let's break that down. This study, Transforming the Electricity Generation of the Berlin-Brandenburg Region, provides a detailed table that shows the installed capacity of different power sources back in, I believe it was late 2011, early 2012. So for Berlin, we're looking at a mix of fossil fuels. They had a bit of lignite, about 164 megawatts.
Oh.
More hard coal, 653 megawatts.
Mm-hmm.
A significant chunk of natural gas,
Mm.
over 1,100 megawatts.
Yeah.
276 megawatts from oil, and then some other sources making up the rest, totaling about 2,370 megawatts for Berlin.
So Berlin had kind of a diverse mix, but still quite a bit of fossil fuels.
Right, but then we go over to Brandenburg, and it's a very different picture. They had a massive 490 megawatts of lignite.
Wow.
No hard coal at the time, but still 865 megawatts of natural gas, 187 megawatts from oil, and then some other sources, totaling about 500 and 661 megawatts. So when you combine Berlin and Brandenburg, you're looking at over 8 gigawatts of fossil fuel power.
That's a lot of capacity.
Yeah.
And it really shows how reliant Brandenburg was on lignite, especially.
Exactly. And what's striking is that Brandenburg's capacity for generating electricity from fossil fuels was way more than what they actually needed to consume themselves.
They were basically an energy exporter.
Yeah, they were sending a lot of that electricity to other parts of Germany.
Interesting. Okay, so that's the fossil fuel side. What about renewables?
Okay, so let's dive into the clean energy landscape at that time. According to Transforming the Electricity Generation of the Berlin-Brandenburg Region. Now, Brandenburg was already quite active in the renewable space. Across the different subregions, there was a mix of biogas, biomass, solar PV, and notably, a considerable amount of wind power. For example, the Prignitz-Oberhavel region had nearly 1,200 megawatts of wind. So when you add it all up, Brandenburg had 132 megawatts of biogas, 208 megawatts of biomass, 1,238 megawatts of PV, and a significant 466 megawatts of wind power.
Wow. Brandenburg was already a wind powerhouse.
Yeah, they were really leading the way there. Now, Berlin, on the other hand, was a bit behind. They had almost no wind, very little biogas, 45 megawatts of biomass, and just 38 megawatts of solar PV.
Okay, so a stark contrast between the two. Brandenburg was already generating a decent chunk of its electricity from renewables, while Berlin was lagging. So this is the starting point. Now, what were the political goals, the official targets for renewable energy and emission reductions that were in place back then?
Right, so let's see what the policy landscape looked like in 2012 when transforming the electricity generation of the Berlin-Brandenburg region was conducted. In Berlin, they had committed to cutting their CO2 emissions by 40% by 2020 compared to 1990 levels. However, at the time, they didn't have specific targets for how much their energy should come from renewable sources.
So they wanted to reduce emissions, but hadn't fully embraced the idea of a specific renewable energy target.
Exactly. They were focusing on the outcome, the reduction in pollution, but not necessarily mandating a specific path to get there. The closest thing they had was this study by the Berlin Energy Agency in 2011 called the Energy Concept 2020.
Right.
It basically outlined ways to achieve those emission reductions, but it didn't really delve into specific renewable energy targets.
Okay. What about Brandenburg? They seem to be much more active on renewables. What were their goals?
Brandenburg had been pretty proactive in developing energy strategies. They started back in 2002 with a 2010 strategy, aiming for 5% renewable energy in their overall energy use.
Okay.
And they actually surpassed that target quite quickly. Then in 2008, they launched the Energy Strategy 2020, aiming for 20% renewable energy in total energy consumption by 2020. Interestingly, this plan still saw lignite power plants as a sort of bridge technology to a cleaner energy future.
That's an interesting point. We'll come back to that idea of bridge technologies later on because it seems like this study kind of challenges that notion.
Definitely.
But Brandenburg didn't stop there, right?
No, they were ambitious. In 2012, they released the Energy Strategy 2030, which had even bolder goals. They wanted to significantly increase renewable energy production and make substantial cuts to their CO2 emissions. They were actually aiming to go beyond the national targets set by Germany as a whole. Figure 3 in the study, transforming the electricity generation of the Berlin-Brandenburg region, really highlights these differences. While their planned reduction in total energy use wasn't quite as steep as Germany's overall plan, that's largely because they were still a major energy exporter relying on lignite. However, their planned growth in renewable energy production was much more aggressive than the national average.
Okay, so it seems like Brandenburg was trying to be a real leader in Germany's energy transition, at least on paper. Now, this study didn't just take these official goals at face value. They actually modeled different scenarios for how to achieve even higher levels of renewable energy. So let's dive into the methodology they used. What were the key simulation models they used?
Right, so the researchers used two main types of models, a single node model, or SNM, and a multi-node model, or M&M. The single-node model basically treats the entire Berlin-Brandenburg region as one big energy zone. It tries to find the most cost-effective combination of power plants and energy storage to meet the electricity demand, assuming different targets for how much of that electricity should come from renewables.
Okay, so the single node model is like the big picture optimizer. It figures out the ideal mix of technologies for the whole region. What about the multi-node model? How is that different?
The multi-node model gets more granular. It takes the ideal mix of energy technologies from the single-node model and then tries to distribute them realistically across the different subregions of Berlin and Brandenburg. It considers things like how much solar and wind resources are available in each location, the capacity of the transmission lines connecting those areas, and so on. It's about understanding how the system would actually work geographically.
It's like taking the ideal blueprint and then figuring out how to build it in the real world with all its limitations.
Exactly. And both of these models, the S&M and the M&M were incredibly detailed. They simulated a whole year, hour by hour, making sure that electricity demand was met every single hour.
That hourly detail is really important because it captures the intermittency of solar and wind power, right?
Absolutely. The sun isn't always shining and the wind isn't always blowing, so you have to make sure you have enough backup power or storage to fill in those gaps.
Okay, so what were some of the other key assumptions they made in these models?
Well, one key assumption was a 20% decrease in the total amount of electricity needed each year in Berlin-Brandenburg. This led to an average power demand of 2.6 gigawatts, with a peak of 3.6 gigawatts, which is lower than what was being used at the time. So they were assuming some level of energy efficiency improvements. Table 3 in the study lists other important technical details they assumed, like the efficiencies of natural gas power plants and systems for making synthetic methane from renewable electricity. They also assume certain capabilities for batteries and the efficiency of storing natural gas. And importantly, they used real-world data for things like electricity demand, solar radiation to estimate solar power output, and wind speed and temperature data to estimate wind turbine output. Table 4 details these data sources.
So they were trying to ground their models in reality as much as possible. Okay, so let's focus on the single node cost optimization model first. How did they find the best energy mix? What were the most important technologies they considered?
So, the single-node model's main job was to find the cheapest way to generate electricity while meeting different renewable energy targets, from 0 all the way up to 100%. It primarily focused on wind turbines and solar panels, PV, along with energy storage in the form of batteries and what they call renewable power methane, or RPM. They also included traditional natural gas power plants as a reliable backup option. Importantly, the amount of electricity they assumed could come from biomass was capped at the levels that were already installed when the study was conducted.
So wind, solar, storage, and natural gas as the main players. And what about biomass? Why was that limited?
They basically assumed that biomass resources were already being used pretty extensively in the region, so they didn't see much room for significant expansion.
Okay, that makes sense. And how did the model decide which energy sources to use at any given time? Was there like a pecking order?
Yes, there was a strict priority order. First, it would use any available electricity from renewable sources, like wind and solar. If there was still demand to be met, it would tap into battery storage. Renewable power methane was next in line, and finally, natural gas power plants were used as the last resort to make sure the lights stayed on.
Okay, so it's all about using the cleanest and most efficient options first. Why were batteries prioritized over renewable power methane, though?
They explain that batteries are generally more efficient. You lose less energy when you store and discharge electricity with batteries compared to the whole process of making methane from renewable electricity, storing it, and then burning it in a power plant. Plus, in their cost assumptions, batteries were typically cheaper than the methane route.
Interesting. So it was a combination of efficiency and cost considerations that drove that decision. I also noticed that the study mentioned looking at things from a homeowner's perspective. How did that fit into the bigger picture?
Yeah, so they did this separate analysis looking at whether it would be financially worthwhile for homeowners to install their own solar panels with battery storage. This was shown in their figure 4, where those household systems are represented in gray. This wasn't directly integrated into the main cost optimization of the entire region's power system. Instead, they were just looking at whether these individual systems would save money for the customer, based on things like electricity prices and how many people might adopt them. This is all detailed in Table 5.
Okay, so it was a sort of side analysis to see if there was an economic case for homeowners to go solar. Did they find that those systems were beneficial?
They did find that under certain conditions, especially as the cost of solar and batteries continued to fall, these household systems could become quite attractive financially. And even though it wasn't part of the main optimization, they did acknowledge that any electricity demand that could be met by these cost-effective home systems would reduce the overall burden on the main grid. And that, of course, would influence the results of the larger system optimization. Any extra electricity these homes generated was assumed to be fed back into the grid, but they assumed a pretty low payment for that excess power.
Makes sense. So they were acknowledging the potential impact of these distributed energy resources, even if they weren't modeling them in detail. Okay, so we've talked about the technologies and the assumptions. Let's talk money. What cost assumptions did they use for all these different energy technologies, both in 2020 and looking ahead to 2030?
Okay, so for the costs, Table 6 in the study gives a breakdown of the assumed upfront investment costs, what they call capital expenditure, or CapEx. They projected, for example, that the cost of solar PV systems would decrease from €1,000 per kilowatt in 2020 to 730 euros per kilowatt in 2030. Wind energy system costs, on the other hand, were assumed to stay pretty much the same at 1,000 euros per kilowatt for both years. Battery costs were also expected to fall significantly between 2020 and 2030. They also had projections for the cost of building systems to produce renewable methane from electricity, which were also expected to decrease considerably. And for traditional natural gas power plants, they kept the costs constant over time. Then in Table 7, they detail the assumed ongoing operating costs, or OPEX, and the expected lifespan of each of these technologies.
So they tried to capture the dynamic nature of technology costs, especially for renewables and storage, which tend to get cheaper over time.
Exactly. And they also used an assumed average cost of financing of 6.4% per year, which is what's called the weighted average cost of capital, or WACC. And they assumed a natural gas price of 50 euros per megawatt hour.
Okay. And what about the cost of carbon emissions? Did they factor that into their calculations?
They explicitly stated that they set the cost of CO2 emissions to zero in their modeling. They acknowledged that this was a conservative assumption because in reality, there's a growing trend towards putting a price on carbon pollution.
Right. So by ignoring the cost of emissions, they're essentially making the fossil fuel options look more financially attractive than they might be in a world where carbon has a price tag.
Exactly. It kind of tilts the playing field a bit in favor of fossil fuels, but they were transparent about that choice.
Good to know. Okay, so after they ran the single node model, they used the results as input for the multi-node model, which is where things get really interesting from a geographical perspective. What was the main goal of this multi-node modeling?
The multi-node model, or MNM, was all about bringing in the geographical realities of Berlin-Brandenburg. We know that wind and solar resources aren't evenly distributed across the region. Some areas are windier than others. Some areas get more sunshine. Plus, the power grid itself has limitations on how much electricity can flow from one place to another. So, the M&M was designed to create a more realistic simulation. They took the cost-optimized energy technology mix from the single-node model scenario for 80% renewable energy in 2020, and then tried to figure out the best way to distribute those power plants and storage facilities across the different parts of Berlin and Brandenburg.
So it's taking the ideal mix and figuring out where to put everything and how to make it all work together in the real world.
Right. And to do that, they had to model the power grid itself. They focused on the high-voltage transmission lines connecting the different areas, as shown in Figure 5. These lines carry large amounts of electricity over long distances. Now, the exact capacity of these lines isn't usually public information, so the researchers had to estimate those capacities based on typical characteristics of power lines, like how much current they can carry, the voltage, the number of cables, and so on. And where multiple lines ran between two areas, they treated them as one bigger connection. But they did have the exact capacity for the underground cable running through Berlin, which they used directly.
Okay, so they were making reasonable estimates for the grid's capacity based on the best available information. What other assumptions did they make for the multi-node model?
One important assumption was that they treated Berlin-Brandenburg as self-sufficient in terms of electricity. They didn't model any electricity trading with neighboring regions. So essentially, they were assuming that all the electricity needed in Berlin-Brandenburg would have to be generated within those two regions.
So a closed system. They were looking for solutions within the region itself.
Exactly. It's a more conservative approach because, in reality, regions often rely on electricity imports and exports to balance their supply and demand. But by assuming self-sufficiency, they were essentially trying to find the most robust solution that wouldn't rely on external factors.
Interesting. So they were setting a high bar for themselves. Okay, what specific energy technologies were included in the multi-node model?
They modeled solar PV and wind turbines, obviously, with their output varying depending on weather conditions. They included energy storage systems, both batteries for short-term storage and gas storage for longer-term storage of energy in the form of methane. Natural gas power plants were included as backup, and they also had dispatchable generation from biogas and solid biomass power plants. Figure 6 provides a visual overview of the components in the M&M.
Okay, so quite a diverse mix of technologies. How did the multi-node model handle all the fluctuations from renewables and the changing electricity demand across these different areas? How did it all get balanced out?
They had these control mechanisms built into the model, which are illustrated in Figure 7. Basically, it prioritized using electricity from wind and solar whenever it was available. If there was an excess of electricity in one area, meaning more was being generated than was needed locally, That excess would be distributed to other areas within Berlin-Brandenburg.
Okay, so it was trying to share this surplus renewable energy around.
Exactly. And this distribution was managed based on the current levels of energy storage in each area. So if one area had less energy stored in its batteries or gas storage, it would get priority for receiving excess electricity from other areas.
Smart. It's like a balancing act to keep the whole system stable.
Right. For biomass and biogas, they assumed a constant hourly electricity output based on the installed capacity and typical operating hours. This output would then be stored in dedicated storage facilities if the electricity wasn't needed immediately. And then finally, the natural gas power plants acted as the ultimate safety net to cover any remaining gaps in electricity demand that couldn't be met by renewables or storage.
Okay, so that gives us a pretty good picture of how the model worked. Now let's get to the results. What did they find for 2020, aiming for that 80% renewable electricity target?
All right, so for the 2020 scenario with the 80% renewable energy goal, Figure 8 in the study shows the cost-optimized installed power generation and storage capacities based on that single-node model. Remember, this is before considering any household solar and battery systems. To reach that 80% target, the model came up with a system that had 8.8 gigawatts of wind energy, 4.8 gigawatts of solar PV, zero point 0.4 gigawatts of bioenergy, zero point 0.6 gigawatts of capacity to produce renewable methane, and a gas storage capacity equivalent to 180 gigawatt hours of energy.
Okay, so a lot of wind and solar plus that renewable methane and storage. How did this compare to what would happen if they just continued with the energy policies that were in place at the time?
The study called that the current policy scenario, and Table 8 provides a comparison. As you might expect, the current policy scenario resulted in much lower installed capacities for both solar PV and wind compared to this more ambitious, accelerated transition scenario.
So business as usual wouldn't get them anywhere near that 80% target.
Right. The current policy scenario projected 2.9 gigawatts of PV and 7.6 gigawatts of wind, while the accelerated scenario envisioned 4.8 gigawatts of PV and 8.8 gigawatts of wind. And crucially, the accelerated scenario also included those renewable methane production and gas storage facilities, which were completely absent in the current policy scenario.
Okay, so it was a pretty significant difference in ambition. Did the researchers think these higher targets were actually realistic to achieve by 2020?
They did consider that, and they argued that it was feasible. For solar PV, they pointed out that reaching 4,800 megawatts by 2020 would require continuing the average growth rate seen in the previous 3 years, which they considered achievable based on market trends and technology advancements.
So basically staying the course, but maybe accelerating a bit.
Right. For wind turbines, they calculated that the required capacity would use less than 2% of the available open space in the region. And the target was only moderately higher than Brandenburg's own goals outlined in their Energy Strategy 2020.
So not a radical departure from what Brandenburg was already aiming for.
Yeah, it was more about aligning Berlin's ambition with what Brandenburg was already doing. They also highlighted that Germany already had enough natural gas storage capacity to handle the needs of the accelerated transition scenario.
That's good to know. It's not like they were proposing something completely outlandish. Okay, so the single node model gave them the ideal mix. Then they fed that into the multi-node model to see how it would play out geographically. What did those results show?
So tables 9 and 10 in transforming the electricity generation of the Berlin-Brandenburg region show how those power generation and storage capacities were distributed across the different subregions in both the accelerated transition scenario and the current policy scenario, respectively. In the accelerated transition scenario, the facilities for producing renewable methane and the gas storage were distributed relatively evenly across the 6 subregions, which includes the 5 in Brandenburg, and then Berlin as its own region.
Okay.
For solar PV and wind, they recognized that Berlin, being a dense city, had limited space. So they allocated the maximum potential there, and then the remaining capacity was distributed evenly across the subregions of Brandenburg.
Makes sense. Put the solar panels where the rooftops are.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that in these multi-node model simulations, all the natural gas power plants were placed in Berlin.
Okay, so keeping the backup power closer to where the biggest electricity demand is, what were the overall results of the multi-node model simulation for that accelerated transition to 80% renewables? Did it match up with what the single node model had predicted?
Figure 9 shows the share of renewable electricity in the net electricity consumption, as simulated by the multi-node model. It came out to around 77%, which is just slightly below the 80% target from the single-node model.
So pretty close. Why the slight difference?
The researchers explained that this small deviation was due to the more detailed spatial modeling in the M&M. It was taking into account the uneven distribution of renewable resources and the constraints of the transmission grid.
Right, so the real-world complexities shaved off a tiny bit of that ideal target.
Yeah, but it's still a very significant achievement. And to highlight that, Figure 10 compares the renewable electricity share in net consumption for both scenarios, showing that the current policy scenario only reached 63%.
Okay, so a big gap between the two approaches. Now, what about those traditional fossil fuel power plants, especially the lignite plants? What role did they play in these future scenarios?
Figure 11 focuses on the remaining electricity demand that would still need to be met by fossil fuels in both scenarios. It uses what are called annual load duration curves. These curves basically show how many hours per year a certain level of power demand exists. So you can see how often those fossil fuel plants would be needed. For context, they also included the total installed capacity of Brandenburg's lignite power plants on this chart.
Okay, so you can see how much those lignite plants could theoretically contribute.
Right. And what's really interesting in the accelerated transition scenario is that while the lignite plants could technically cover a lot of that remaining demand, they would only be operating for a very small number of hours at their full capacity.
So they'd be sitting idle most of the time.
Pretty much. And that makes them very uneconomical to operate. The study pointed out that back in 2012, German lignite plants were operating for many more hours at full load. But in both the accelerated and current policy scenarios they modeled, those lignite plants would spend a lot of time running at partial load, which further hurts their efficiency and financial viability.
So basically, they're saying that holding on to these big, inflexible lignite plants doesn't really make sense in a future with lots of wind and solar.
Exactly. The economics just don't work out.
Hmm.
And that led them to this pretty strong conclusion that inflexible lignite power is not a suitable bridge to a high renewable energy system.
That's a really important point. It challenges that whole idea of using fossil fuels as a temporary crutch while we transition to renewables.
Yeah, it suggests that in some cases, those traditional fossil fuel plants might become more of a liability than an asset as we move towards a cleaner energy future.
Interesting. Okay, so what about the power grid itself? Could the existing transmission lines handle all this extra renewable energy flowing around within Berlin and Brandenburg?
Figures 12 and 13 show the power flows between the different subregions in the accelerated transition scenario. Figure 12 highlights the connections that were used the most, particularly those direct lines leading into Berlin. Those were heavily utilized because that's where the biggest electricity demand is.
Right, makes sense.
Figure 13 shows the connections that were used less frequently, and you can see that the patterns generally reflect where the population is concentrated. It's all about moving that electricity to where the people are. Importantly, the study concluded that the existing high-voltage transmission capacity within the Berlin-Brandenburg region was sufficient to handle the levels of renewable energy they were modeling.
Okay, so no major grid bottlenecks within the region itself.
At least not for these 2020 scenarios. They did caution that their analysis didn't consider the potential impact of electricity transmission to or from other parts of Germany. So if Berlin or Brandenburg was exporting or importing a lot of electricity, that could change the picture.
Right, so there might be broader grid considerations that they didn't capture in this regional analysis. Makes sense. Okay, so that's 2020. Let's jump ahead to 2030. What did they find when they modeled that 100% renewable electricity scenario?
All right, so for 2030, things get even more ambitious. The researchers used the projected costs for 2030, assuming that things like solar panels and batteries would continue to get cheaper, and they also started factoring in the growing role of those household solar and battery systems. Figure 14 shows the cost-optimized power generation and storage capacities for different levels of renewable electricity share in 2030. They found that by this point, those home-based solar and battery systems would be economically attractive for a lot of consumers and could potentially meet about 5% of the total electricity demand in the region.
So homeowners become a real part of the solution in 2030.
Exactly. And when they modeled that 100% renewable electricity system for 2030, the optimal mix included 10.2 gigawatts of solar PV, 9.5 gigawatts of wind, 11 gigawatt hours of battery storage, a large 530 gigawatt hours of gas storage for renewable methane, and 1.5 gigawatts of capacity to produce that renewable methane.
Okay, so still a lot of wind, but solar really takes the lead in this 2030 scenario.
Yeah, it seems like the continued cost reductions for solar and batteries really tip the scales in favor of solar in this longer-term scenario. And they noticed this interesting kink in the graph for wind capacity around the 55% renewable energy mark. They explained that this was due to the increasing profitability of solar systems that could better match the daily patterns of electricity demand. So as you get more solar in the mix, you need less excess energy from wind power to be stored or managed.
So solar starts to handle more of the daily peaks and valleys of electricity demand. What about the overall cost of this 100% renewable system in 2030? Was it significantly more expensive than the fossil fuel-based alternative?
Well, they calculated something called the levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE, which is a way to compare the lifetime costs of different electricity generation options. They found that the LCOE for the 100% renewable system in 2030 would be around 11 euro cents per kilowatt hour. But they emphasized that this was a worst-case scenario in a way because they assumed they wouldn't be able to use any of the existing natural gas power plant infrastructure.
Okay, so they were assuming they'd have to build all new renewable energy and storage capacity.
Right. And if they could utilize those existing gas plants as backup, the actual cost would likely be lower. For comparison, they estimated the LCOE of a system with zero renewable energy, relying only on natural gas, to be around 10 euro cents per kilowatt hour.
So pretty close in terms of cost, even with that conservative assumption for the renewables.
Exactly. And remember, this doesn't even account for the cost of carbon emissions, which they had set to zero in their modeling. So if you factor in a price on carbon, the renewable option would likely become even more economically attractive.
Right, so all signs point to a 100% renewable system being achievable and potentially even cheaper in the long run. Okay, let's wrap up. What were the main takeaways from transforming the electricity generation of the Berlin-Brandenburg region? What were the key conclusions and recommendations?
Okay, so in their conclusions, they emphasized that achieving a high renewable electricity supply for Berlin-Brandenburg is not just a pipe dream. It's a feasible and affordable goal. They really hammered home the importance of scaling up energy storage technologies alongside the expansion of renewable energy. They pointed out that at the time there wasn't really a clear roadmap for how to integrate energy storage into the electricity market, and they strongly encouraged the development of